Hi there, and welcome back. We are finishing up, finally, American Literature, 1820 to 1865. Hopefully, you've watched the three previous videos. They're on the module. If you notice, I did change this final slide just a little bit here. Remember, we're talking about how even though America is coming into its own as far as a creator of a unique and homebrewed culture and literary tradition, there is still synergy and important intellectual and cultural conversation that is happening between the old world and North America, the United States. And it becomes, I don't know if we could ever say equal in footing according to some people's minds. Some people's minds, Europe's always going to be more cultured and more literary. I don't agree with that philosophy, but the 19th century really shows America to be a literary and also cultural force to be contended with. And this whole anthology, Volume B, is really going to help bring that point home. I did mention here all these other important writers who have served overseas or lived overseas. Some people know this as the expatriate or expat tradition. If you ever get a chance to live overseas and study or work overseas as well, I really, really strongly recommend it. So anyway, I revised this last bullet here, this last bullet from the last slide. Um, there were very important members of the abolition movement who did visit England and lecture. Frederick Douglass is probably the most well-known name. William Wells Brown was also an African American abolition activist and a writer who visited England and lectured. He wrote what is considered the first African American novel called Clotel, I'm sorry, Clotel. Um, it was published in England, so it doesn't count as the first African American novel published in the US. But I mean, as far as like the first one ever published, he's the guy. And Harriet Jacobs, who wrote uh, Insights from a Slave Girl, also a prominent African American abolitionist and a writer as well. And finally, we get some very strong literary correspondence between Walt Whitman and Oscar Wilde. I could kind of see the connection there. We could probably talk about that at a later lecture. Bram Stoker and other British writers. Wow, could you imagine being in a room and hanging out with Whitman and Wilde and Stoker while they're just going off? Wow, that would be fun. All right. Now let's talk a little bit about Ralph Waldo Emerson. You probably thought we were never going to get to him. A lot's been going on, but it's okay. He is a really important 19th century figure for lots of reasons. I talked a little bit before about author portraits, and his certainly does not disappoint. Look how stately it is. He's looking off, three-quarter shot, with a pensive look on his face, very finely dressed. He's a civilized man, even though he kind of does have the Wolverine mutton chops, right? Snicked. But if you want to take one point away about Ralph Waldo Emerson's life, he is considered to be the most important influential American writer of the 19th century. I mean, his influence and range really ripples across the rest of the 19th century well into the 20th century, especially as an author of the Transcendentalist movement. Graduates from Harvard in 1821 at the age of 18. Not bad, right? And before he became a writer, he worked as a schoolmaster and as a pastor, pastor for a Unitarian church. He was never really satisfied with either one of these callings. And the biographical notes make that pretty clear. What I think you should also keep in mind too is that even though he's considered a really influential figure, and even though there may be some dispute in terms of more recent scholarship, you can always tell how important the editors of the Norton anthology think a certain writer is based on how much space they give to their biographical notes. And if you know Emerson's, they go on for three to 4 pages. So that means they think he's a pretty big deal. And I'll agree with them for the most part. I don't always agree with Norton, but I certainly will on this. He was very much an advocate for universal human rights. He was a big proponent of abolition, and also of women's suffrage. And he is definitely credited with founding Transcendentalism, an American literary and philosophical movement. So Emerson, he starts at his religious beliefs, at least in adulthood, as a Unitarian. And a Unitarian is a person who has a faith that is, I guess in some ways you would say, non-denominational. It's not interested in all of those separating characteristics that might divorce Presbyterians from Episcopalians, from Catholics, from Baptists, and even more so, Christians from Jews, from Hindus, from Buddhists. So it's a very humanistic faith that is about acknowledging divinity of people and being compassionate and helpful. Now, even that is not enough for him as he continues to grow into his this burgeoning philosophy that he has. And here's a nice illustration of Emerson talking to a large audience in Concord, Massachusetts. He had a summer school of philosophy that he started, and a lot of the premier forward-thinking minds of the time were there and were very interested in Emerson's work. So I know a lot of you don't like taking summer school, and maybe less would like taking a summer school of philosophy. I don't know, man. It could be kind of cool. It depends on the assignments, though, right? But anyway, he was the originator and the focal point for these new ways of thinking about the relationship between mind and spirit, between culture and nature. And he loved getting people together to talk about it. So he's also a really important organizing force in that way. And probably the most famous piece that Emerson wrote was his book-long essay called Nature. Now, some of you may know from reading Emerson before. Maybe you read Self-Reliance, for example. That's a popular one. His writing style and structure is a bit different from some of the other people we've read, especially the Enlightenment writers. You know, he tends to have a more winding and digressive and circuitous line of thinking. And he's okay with that. He's okay with taking the road less taken and going down certain paths and talking about issues and then coming back. Now look at this quotation right there. All that is separate from us, all which philosophy distinguishes as the not me, that is, both nature and art, all other men and my own body must be ranked under this name nature. Everything that's not me is nature, basically. He's saying nature in the common sense refers to essences unchanged by man. Space, the air, the river, the leaf. Art is applied to the mixture of his will with the same things, as in a house, a canal, a statue, a picture. So I've left the definition of transcendentalism to the end of this slide presentation. I'm not sure if exactly that's the right thing to do, but I'm kind of building up to it through these different excerpts. What we need to know about Emerson and his philosophy at this point is basically this, that there is the me or the I or the ego or the self, whatever you want to call it, that basically the consciousness of an individual on one side, and then there's nature on another. Okay. And there is this kind of division between them, because as much as I try to convey what I'm thinking and feeling from my consciousness, it has to be mediated through language. It has to be understood. Um, Maybe it's mediated through another art form, or another communication channel. The point is that it's partial, right? Um, Nature, on the other hand, is very large, and diverse in its own way, and it is a different force entirely outside of the me or the self. So, if we want to look at these in philosophical terms, we can use what's called the dialectic. And this is something that goes back to a German philosopher named Hegel, who was a predecessor of Karl Marx, and Karl Marx uses him um, when he talks about communism and communist theory. But it doesn't necessarily just have to apply to that. It's the idea that you have these two things that are separate: a thesis, and that's the me, the self, the I, the consciousness, and nature. And there is a split between them in some way. There's something that makes them separate and distinct. Um, those two things, when they do come together, make something completely new. It's got elements from each, but it is its own new thing. And it has like a synergy. It has something new that is greater than the sum of its parts. That new thing, that synthesis, is art. Art is a combination of the self, the I, the consciousness, the individual, and nature in some way and somehow. And that new synthesis then can become a thesis with some other element, maybe another individual and their conception, and then they make another piece of art. Art builds off of art, builds off of art, builds off of nature at some point, I think, is one way you can be looking at it. And it's a little bit confusing, but I don't want us to get too bogged down in that. The other thing I will have you keep in mind is, I talked a little bit about his digressive style. There's another really important way in which Emerson and his thinkers and other transcendentalists differ from the Enlightenment thinkers, including John Locke, is that they don't believe that the mind is a blank slate necessarily, that it's a tabula rasa, something that has nothing on it. They think by its nature, the mind, the I, the me, is inherently intuitive and creative. You could maybe even put communicative in there too. Now, we've got a couple more quotes from nature to kind of flesh out and build, kind of line by line definition of uh, transcendentalism for you. This first one from nature, and by the way, you can see it's in the Norton. Every particular in nature, a leaf, a drop, a crystal, a moment of time, is related to the whole and partakes of the perfection of the whole. Each particle is a microcosm and faithfully renders the likeness of the world. So when we think about this quote, what we can keep in mind is that Emerson is saying that there is something inherently linked and inherently connected between the infinite, the insanely huge, and the infinitesimal, the mind-blowingly small, the vastness of the universe on one hand, and the tiniest of interstitial subatomic spaces and elements and particles, your leptons and other such things. Now, how is this related to us as human beings? Well, we're somewhere in the middle then. And what we have to keep in mind is that being in that middle, we have to recognize that there is something of the universe in every instance of life.